Hello everyone, it's Silver. This is Virgo versus the Zodiac. So I'm taking a look at this mostly because the developer of this game has just released their newest project, which is called Keylocker, which I'll be taking a look at tomorrow. But when I was researching that game back before it came out, I noticed that they had a previous RPG that also looked really interesting and was quite similar mechanically to Keylocker, and that is this game. So I decided I'm just going to take a look at both, because why not? So I played them both, and I'm going to take a look at them one after the other as a sort of celebration, both of just, for their new game, but also as just a celebration of small team indie RPG projects, because those are some of my favorite things to cover. Upon first starting this, it'll be very obvious what the developer's biggest inspirations are, including, of course, things like Earthbound, because it is going for a sort of inscrutable, silly, and interesting world that is very celestial themed. In this case, you do play as Virgo, and you are going after the other Zodiacs to get their crowns and eventually melt them down and sort of go back to the way things used to be. So as for how this game looks, it looks quite good in my opinion. It uses a very, very chunky pixel art style that heavily simplifies and almost sort of chibifies a lot of the characters and makes them just sort of adorable and pixely. But in combination with this, you've also got some more detailed environment art and stuff that's still quite chunky but has more room for details. It fits more in it. And also on top of this, you've got sort of anime-esque portraits for the characters, a lot of close-ups and portraits and cut-ins and all those things that show the characters more closely. They have a highly stylized, very colorful style to them that looks really good, and it reminds me of like mid to late 2000s anime, basically, is how it looks. It also helps that the in-battle animations are quite nice. They are, chunky but detailed animations that are flashy and powerful looking, and that's what you want for a combat system like this. But I think the real star of the show here is how it sounds, because it sounds really, really good. The music for this game is excellent. It's got, well, as you would probably expect for something that is very celestial themed, the music is highly electronic, and it crosses between several EDM electronic style genres. I'm not really that well versed in those genres, so I'm not going to detail them, but it does have a pretty good variety of music, from the more sort of chill exploration tracks, which are really nice, to the much more upbeat and fast and aggressive boss fight tracks. You'll find that they've done a really good job of matching the mood of the music with the area that you're currently in. So if you're in Pisces area, it's like, well, it's called the cemetery. It's a cemetery underwater. So everything is very floaty and bubbly and kind of whimsical, but at the same time sort of dark because it is a cemetery. But when you're in Capricorn's area, which is like a giant office building with a ton of salary goats, then it's going to be a lot more of the sort of upbeat electronic stuff, lots of computery sounds and things happening. It's just really cool. I think they've done a really good job of matching the vibe of each area, and especially of each Zodiac in their boss fights. When you're actually fighting one of the Zodiacs, they all have their own boss fight music, and these have been the most memorable tracks in the game for me. Now, mechanically, the game has quite a lot going on and is overall a relatively difficult game, although the difficulty is customizable, and a lot of it relies on timed hits. So this is the kind of JRPG that is taking inspiration mechanically from stuff like Super Mario RPG and Chrono Trigger and things like that. So you have these big timed hits where you are encouraged to press a specific button at a specific time whenever something is happening, and pretty much everything has a timed hit on it. All of your party's attacks and all of the enemy's attacks for you to defend from, they all have some sort of timed hit, and each of your characters actually uses a different button to perform them, which can get a little bit confusing at first because they use this button for everything, even stuff like using items and things that everyone can do. So it's a little bit weird at first. And all of it's kind of underlined by the triple stat system that the game uses, which is color-coded. You'll see ambition, versatility, and patience. And each of your main characters that you use has one of those stats as kind of their main stat. They can use equipment from other stats, but you'll notice that the more you level them up, the more their specific stat increases above the others. And there is a very rock, paper, scissors-esque system where one of these stats is strong against one, but weak against the other. And you'll find that where all the complexity really comes in is building your characters, because you have 8 different equipment slots to actually put stuff into. You've got 4 offensive and 4 defensive slots, and each of the 4 directions on the D-pad is using one of those slots, or whatever is in that slot, to act in some way. So each one can only hold a specific type of thing. You can't just put anything wherever you want. And also there are some pieces of equipment that are limited to a specific character rather than being equipable by everyone. Everything also gives some stats, but also usually takes away from another. Sometimes it's one of the main stats, and sometimes it's more of a derived statistic like speed or crit chance or things like that. And you can tell what sort of element, almost you could call them, what stat each weapon uses just by what color it is. And the enemies also tend to have a similar color scheme. They have a lot more variety so that it's not always as obvious, but they will generally have some sort of predominant color that is a shade of one of these three stats. It is a turn-based system, and it does matter the order of your characters. So on the right side of the screen, you'll see your characters line up in a row, and the front character can attack with a melee weapon, as well as be attacked by a melee weapon of the front enemy. And the rest of the characters cannot hit with melee, but do have ranged attacks that they can use instead. However, if they choose their melee weapon anyway, then it will automatically put them towards the front. So you're encouraged to shuffle your characters around pretty often to determine who's at the front, based on who you want to attack with and who is better at defending against certain enemies. But you also have your defensive options. So the way that you use these is the item in your offhand on the right of the D-pad will be some sort of thing that gives you purity, and purity acts like a shield or like armor. It basically sits in front of your health gauge and takes damage before your health does. And whenever you get hit with some purity remaining, even if it takes all of it, you'll get the chance to counterattack. And the counterattack is where the 4 defensive slots appear rather than the 4 offensive ones. Counterattacks are often quite strong in this game, and they even have their own sort of counter stat that helps to amplify how powerful they are, so they do get really strong. But the enemies can do this too, by the way. Enemies that have the ability to gain purity just like you can also counter when they get hit. So sometimes it might be worth waiting for the purity to decay off of them instead, because every turn you lose a certain amount of your built-up purity. It's different for every character and every enemy, but it does eventually go away. So it is possible to just wait through it instead of attacking it if you want. Boss fights is where this is not usually possible. Pretty much every boss fight has different ways to gain purity, usually a lot of it, and they also tend to have very powerful counterattacks. But you can't just wait around, because they can continue to gain purity even as they lose it, and they can also deal a lot of damage while you're sitting there waiting, and it's just not really viable to stand there and do nothing. The bosses are just simply too powerful for you to do that. So a lot of the boss fights are kind of DPS races, right? You're trying to damage them faster than they damage you. There is a healing item system thing in the game that's a little bit unusual. You have 3 different healing items, one for each of those stats. They're coffee, tea, and lemonade. As far as I can tell, they always heal roughly the same amount no matter who you use them on, so the stat part isn't really important for the healing part. They all just are a really big heal for whoever you use them on. But they also buff the stat that they represent, so they're not just a heal, they're a heal and like a power buff, sort of damage and defense of that stat. So if you use Lemonade on Virgo, who uses versatility, which is the Lemonade stat, then you'll be better off because she'll get a big boost to all of her green versatility attacks. And in fact, the attacks have specific names depending on which of these 3 stats they are tied to, that being cardinal, mutable, and fixed. So the complexity comes from building your 3 characters with 8 pieces of equipment each in these different slots to sort of form a build that's specific to them, oftentimes using their specific stat if you can, but also maybe dipping into others sometimes so that they aren't as limited against certain enemy types and things because of the rock, paper, scissors system. The timed hits are pretty fast. They do take a lot of getting used to. They usually come out real fast and you've got to react as soon as possible, but you'll also find that there are a lot of different kinds of timed hits. There's like the shrinking circle one where it eventually turns blue, and if you hit it right as it turns blue, then you'll get a perfect, but if you miss it, then you could get like an early or a miss, which will sometimes help a little bit, but not as much as getting a perfect would. You've also got ones where there are just like a sequence of arrows. You have to press the D-pad in that order at the right time. There's also the one where there's a bar with a sort of gradient somewhere in it, and you've got to try and stop a moving slider right in the center of it as best as you can to get a perfect. There's a whole bunch of different ones, and this is good because it means there's a lot of variety to the combat. Every weapon will have its own specific type of timed hit that it does, as well as a bit of a different timing than some of the others you might be used to. So whenever you're switching equipment for your characters, you're also switching which timed hit minigames that they might be using, so you're going to have to get used to new ones. And this is also important for the enemies, of course. When you encounter new enemies, you got to learn what types of timed hits with what timings they use. So there is quite a learning curve to the combat in this game simply because of all this timing that you've got to learn. There are also some other consumables that are more offensive that you can use like as weapons in battle, basically. And there's also no revival item, by the way. If a character goes down, you can just use the normal healing items on them and it'll pick them back up again, which is unusual. I also like the fact that if you hit an enemy just right with a perfect timed attack, then they'll actually fly across the screen and explode if it reduces them to 0 HP. And story-wise, the game is in a very interesting place, and I say that because you can tell that things like Earthbound were a big influence on this developer and their writing style, but the thing about being influenced by that game is it's really hard to write that way. That game, and also similar games of the era like Chrono Trigger or Final Fantasy VI, they have really memorable writing and really good character moments and things, and those things are really difficult to emulate. And one mistake I sometimes see RPGs, indie RPGs that are going for an Earthbound inspiration make is that they try to be too similar to Earthbound, or they try to sort of ape that style of writing, and they can't quite get it, so it comes off as sort of hollow impersonation instead. And that's unfortunate, but it's just the sort of thing that happens sometimes when you're inspired by something that's so legendary. But in this case, they've managed to take that inspiration and spin it in their very own direction, and the game is not written like any other game I've ever played. So it doesn't feel like it's trying to be Earthbound. It feels like it was made by people that loved Earthbound but wanted to make their own thing. You can see the difference in games like Undertale, for instance, which is so popular partially because of that. It has its own unique style, its own charm, and yeah, it's very heavily inspired by Earthbound, but it's also Undertale, and it's not anything else. There's nothing else quite like it, and it's not trying to be anything other than itself. And you get that same feeling with this game. The writing is kind of off-kilter and very unusual in a lot of ways. You're kind of playing a villain, sort of, but you're playing a villain in a world that's so corrupt and strange and off-balance that it's kind of hard to say who is really good or evil. Everyone's just kind of doing their own thing, and yours happens to be a sort of slaughter of a lot of the other Zodiacs to get their crowns. Virgo is a very unpleasant person that calls herself the Holy Queen and sort of sees herself as the ruler of all existence and wants to go back to the Golden Age. It's not exactly stated what the Golden Age was or why she wants to go back to it, not in the earlier parts of the game, but there's something about it that she wants to return to. A lot of the other characters in the game, including both of your other party members, are stars, so they have their own personalities and are related to one of the Zodiacs because they're a star in their constellation. So they've created this pretty interesting world where every constellation is sort of its own realm of existence, and all of the stars and nebulae and things within it are all sort of personified as people, with the Zodiacs themselves being kind of godlike figures that rule over everything else, and often know that, and treat everyone else as if they rule over them. So pretty much all of them are megalomaniacal in some way or otherwise very unpleasant, except for just a couple that are a little bit different, but most of the Zodiac are really abrasive and angry all the time. As far as what the message is for this game's story, it's very cloaked in like celestial metaphor and stuff, so I'm not 100% sure yet what I would say the overarching message is, if it has a specific one, but I would say there's definitely a lot of like the way that the Zodiac interact with each other and the way that the stars work and everything. It reminds me a lot of like office politics. It has that same kind of vibe. But it does have a really neat world to explore, with each of the Zodiac's areas that you go to being vastly different from the last, and also having, of course, its own music and its own themes and enemies and everything. So it does have a lot of variety to it, and it's a pretty long indie RPG. It'll probably last you around like 20 to 25 hours, which for this style of game is a good amount of time. I should also mention that even though I said earlier that it can be a bit difficult, it's not a grindy game. The difficulty doesn't come from needing to have bigger numbers. The difficulty comes from needing to understand how to hit the timed hits correctly, basically, is where it comes from. So you're not going to be forced to grind at any point. You level up at a pretty consistent pace throughout the whole game, and never did I feel that I was under-leveled for an area. There's also a save dinosaur, which I feel is very important. More games could use a save dinosaur, a sort of save menu that involves a dinosaur that helps you out, and he actually exists in universe as well. He shows up sometimes and other characters mention him, so he actually does exist in canon, which is kind of funny. But overall, I had a really good time with Virgo versus the Zodiac. It's a really odd experience, but in a good way. If you've ever played a game like Off, for instance, this game really heavily reminds me of Off. That is a sort of off-kilter French RPG that's very strange and very French. But if you appreciate that style of kind of interesting indie RPG, then this, I would say, kind of slots into that space. And you'll probably like this as well because it's really well made and has a lot of really cool combat variety and equipment variety and stuff for building purposes that makes it more than just a neat story. There's also some pretty crunchy mechanics to dig your teeth into when it comes to that sort of thing. So I'll put the link in the description below this video to the Steam store page for Virgo versus the Zodiac. Thank you guys very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.